morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us here at the Jewish Museum. My name is Jenna Weiss. I'm the Associate Director of Public Programs, and it's my pleasure to welcome you back to Unpacking the Book, Jewish Writers in Conversation. Tonight's talk, Always the Other, The Continued Rise of Antisemitism from Dreyfus to Today, features Rabbi Diana Fer and author Maurice Samuels in conversation with series moderator Stephanie Butnick. We would like to thank the Rita J. and Stanley H. Kaplan Foundation, whose generous endowment support makes the Saul and Gladys Gortzman Lecture possible each year. This event is co-presented with Jewish Book Council and Tablet Magazine, and I would like to take this opportunity to thank collaborators at both organizations, specifically Evie Sapphire Bernstein, for all their work on this season's programming. We hope that you'll join us for the final event of the season on Thursday, May 16th at 6 p.m. for a virtual panel with Rabbis Sharon Brous and Shai Held. For details about all of our upcoming public programs, please visit our website to sign up for our e-news. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Naomi Firestone-Teeter, CEO of Jewish Book Council, to tell you a little bit more about tonight's event.
Thank you so much, Jenna, and as always, I'm pleased to welcome you on behalf of Jewish Book Council. We're thrilled to present Unpacking the Book, the 10th season, in partnership with the Jewish Museum and Tablet Magazine. Each program we've offered in the series brings together authors who approach similar subject matter through a unique lens. Tonight, we will be exploring the unfortunately timely subject of anti-Semitism with Rabbi Diana Fer and Maurice Samuels, authors of We Need to Talk About Anti-Semitism and Alfred Dreyfus, The Man at the Center of the Affair, respectively. Over the last 6 months, there's been an alarming increase in anti-Semitic rhetoric and incidents, and the field in which Jewish Book Council operates, the publishing and literary world, is not immune. We've seen author events canceled, boycott lists with the names of editors, agents, and authors, online harassment of members of our community, censorship, review bombing, and digital abuse on our own accounts, among other challenges. Our work to educate, enrich, and strengthen the community through Jewish literature has expanded to support members of our literary community who have become increasingly isolated and have struggled to navigate this new landscape. It also means that it's more important than ever to amplify the Jewish books in our network, ensure that they have a platform, and that they find curious readers. And we're grateful to all of you for being with us to support the incredible authors who are joining us for today's discussion. To learn more about all of our efforts at JBC, to find reviews, essays, and our book club resources, to learn about our author tours and our literary journal Paper Brigade, and our literary awards, including the National Jewish Book Awards and Nantan Notable Books, I hope you will visit our website or come find a JBC staffer at the end of the program to learn more and even become a member. Before I pass things over to Stephanie, I'd like to very quickly thank the Jewish Museum, and specifically Jenna, and our media sponsor, Tablet Magazine. A very special thank you as well to Evie Sapphire Bernstein, Jewish Book Council's program director, for managing all the ins and outs of this program. And I'm especially grateful to JBC's board of directors for their continued support of Jewish literature, ideas, and conversation. Finally, you will have the opportunity to purchase both of our panelists' books tonight, a very important part of supporting authors in our community, following tonight's program. And now I'd like to introduce you to Stephanie. Stephanie Butnick is a host of the wildly popular Jewish podcast Unorthodox, produced by Tablet Magazine, where she has worked for more than a decade in various writing and editing roles. She is the co-author of the newest Jewish encyclopedia, From Abraham to Zabars and Everything in Between, and she helped edit Tablet's first book, The 100 Most Jewish Foods, a highly debatable list. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and the New York Post. Thank you so much for joining us, and please enjoy the evening.
Thank you. Thank you, Naomi. Thank you, Naomi and Jenna and Evie and everyone who helps make this event possible. You know, listening to what Naomi was just saying, the work of the Jewish Book Council is so incredibly important right now, and the things they're doing behind the scenes, in front of the scenes, it's just really, really special to be a part of it, and I'm grateful to the Jewish Museum for hosting this kind of important conversation, and to all of you for being here tonight. we're going to have a fascinating discussion. I know it already, no pressure. It will be fascinating because what we're going to really talk about is how we need to understand history in order to make sense of our present moment and in order to act in a way that shows that we understand the context in which we are operating. And I think that that's why tonight is going to be a really, really special conversation. I'm going to introduce my two panelists right now. Rabbi Diana Fer is the senior rabbi at Village Temple in Manhattan. She served as national vice president of the Women's Rabbinic Network and is a member of the New York Board of Rabbis. For more than a decade, Rabbi Fer has been preaching and teaching about anti-Semitism. Maurice Samuels is the Betty Jane Anlyan Professor of French at Yale University and a specialist in 19th century French culture. He has directed the Yale program for the study of anti-Semitism since 2011 and is a recipient of the Guggen Fellowship and the New York Public Library Cullman Center Fellowship. This is his 5th book. Welcome, Diana and Maurice.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
So what is going to happen is that I'm going to ask my amazing panelists a few questions. We're going to have a conversation, and then there will be an opportunity for all of you to write any questions you have on little note cards, and someone's going to come around with pencils, and then someone's going to come around and collect them. Then they'll bring them up here. We'll get to your Q&A, and then you guys, after the event, can buy a book right there, get it signed right there. They'll write whatever you want in it, right?
Exactly.
And yeah, so I make all those promises. So, Maurice, let's start with you. The very first line of your book is, Alfred Dreyfus would not have wanted to be the subject of this book. And you say, rarely has so private a person been forced to live so public a life. So I want to do what Dreyfus would have hated and talk about him. I think a lot of us know the Dreyfus affair to some degree or other. We learned about it, we maybe remember it, we maybe know a lot about it. And I think, as your book so expertly points out, even fewer of us really understand who Alfred Dreyfus was. So I'd like for you, before everyone buys your book, to start by telling us about the man and the affair.
Okay. I sometimes, when I talk to people about the Dreyfus Affair, I ask audiences, what do you know about the Dreyfus Affair? And pretty much people say, oh, I know a lot. Well, I know that he was Jewish, and that's kind of it, for most people. So, and that's totally fine. So first I'll say a little bit about the affair, and then I'll say something about Dreyfus himself. So, the affair was a scandal in late 19th century France involving a false accusation of treason against a Jewish army officer that wound up dividing the French nation, riveting the world, and really bringing liberal democracy to a crisis. So a few key facts about what happened. In 1894, the French army discovered there was a traitor in its midst. Someone had been selling secrets to Germany. Suspicion immediately fell on Dreyfus, who was the only Jew on the French army's general staff. They arrested him. There was a hasty 3-day court-martial based on very little evidence. He was found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment on Devil's Island, which is a tiny island off the coast of French Guiana, off of the coast of South America. And the conditions there were unbelievably brutal. He was the only prisoner. He was watched day and night. He was given inedible rations to eat. They had a light shining on him all night with bugs crawling all over him. He was chained to his bed. He survived 5 years of unbearable torture, not having any idea what had happened, why he had been accused. He was completely innocent. Meanwhile, back in France, his devoted wife and brother led a campaign to clear his name. And at first, nobody believed them. Even the Jewish community assumed he must be guilty. And because everyone believed the army, they couldn't believe that the army would lie like that and try to cover up the actual traitor. So eventually, the proof of his innocence emerged. The proof was that someone else had actually offered to sell those military secrets to Germany. The French army doubled down on the false accusation, but eventually more and more people began to believe that Dreyfus was innocent. Intellectuals came to his aid, including the famous novelist Émile Zola, who really blew the lid off the case. The army was forced to bring him back for a second trial in 1899. He was found guilty again, shockingly, even though there was really no evidence. It was pure anti-Semitism. But at that point, the French government realized they had to end the affair. They offered him a pardon. And then it took 6 more years for him eventually to be fully exonerated, which he was in 1906. So that's the affair. I'm happy to go into other details. But about Dreyfus himself, I'll just say that he was an incredibly shy, reserved man. He was a born and bred army officer from a well-to-do Jewish family in Alsace on the eastern border of France. He was intensely patriotic. All he ever wanted to do was serve France. And for him, this was the worst thing imaginable, that he could be accused of treason. There would be no worse crime he could be accused of. I say in the book that I think that most historians have not given him his due. People tend to focus on other people in the affair who were heroes, like Zola, the novelist, or Colonel Picard, who was an anti-Semitic officer who ultimately did the right thing and helped bring the truth to light. But I try to show in the book that Dreyfus himself was incredibly heroic, and that if it hadn't been for his unbelievable ability to withstand torture for 5 years, the truth would never have emerged. So that's one of the things I try to show in the book.
And in many ways, Dreyfus's Judaism was central to the charges against him, but also gets written out of the story both in the moment and, as you point out, like today.
Yeah, so that's actually a debate among historians whether he was accused because of anti-Semitism or not. And some people say, well, he was actually also a modernizer, and there was a whole group of kind of the old boys network within the French army that was against modernizing in the army. So that's true, he was, but all the Jewish officers, and it's important to point out that there were 300 Jewish officers in the French army at the end of the 19th century. So he was far from alone, even though he was the only Jew who had made it to the army's general staff, which was very high up. So it's clear that when they were trying to figure out who the traitor was, they looked at a list of names of the people on the general staff. He was the only Jewish name, and they immediately assumed it had to have been him. So there's really no doubt that anti-Semitism was central to the case. But what's interesting is that even from the time, many of his supporters didn't want to call too much attention to the issue of anti-Semitism. They felt like if they did, people would think this was just a Jewish thing. So they wanted to interest all French people. They wanted to universalize the affair. They made it about a fight for truth, a fight for justice, which it certainly was, but it was also a fight against anti-Semitism. And I think that many historians have tended to take that universalizing line, especially I think many French historians. I think the French are slightly less willing, I think, to talk about anti-Semitism, to quote Diana's book, although that's beginning to change.
Wow, right? We just learned a lot. That was like the best history lesson I think we could have gotten. So, Diana, your book brings us directly to today. It's called We Need to Talk About Anti-Semitism. There's a lot of urgency there. And the way you've organized the chapters, we need to talk about Christianity, we need to talk about the Holocaust, we need to talk about race, we need to talk about Israel. But I want to start in like the very first chapter, one of the first few pages of the book, where you ask, what even is anti-Semitism? So I would love to sort of open that very, very, very easy question to you and explain, now that we've gotten our history lesson, let's understand what anti-Semitism is.
Sure. So the first thing I want to say is, Maurice, when you're speaking, my brain, it's like ping, 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 because so many aspects of that story feel so resonant with what's happening today. And we'll get to those later, I think. So what is anti-Semitism? There are lots of definitions of anti-Semitism. This is a major fight happening right now. What definition should be accepted? Where should it go? As a pragmatist, I like a definition that Rabbi Jonathan Sacks put forward. He was the chief rabbi of England, for those who don't know, until his passing. And he wrote that anti-Semitism is not allowing Jews to exist collectively the way we allow others to exist collectively. I like that definition because, one, it's easy to memorize, and two, it applies to situations larger and smaller. So, we've seen sort of smaller instances of anti-Semitism where a parent will say, my child's school has all these affinity groups. Isn't that wonderful? There's a group for African American kids. There's a group for LGBTQ plus kids. I asked my administrator for a group for the Jewish kids, and they said, now's not the time, or the optics don't look good. That's an example of not allowing us to exist collectively the way we allow others to exist collectively. But you can also apply that same definition to really much larger scale topics, like how we talk about the state of Israel itself. Do we allow the Jews in Israel to exist collectively the way we allow other states to exist collectively? So that's the definition that I prefer.
And I like that, first of all. Do we like that? We like that, yes. Could you diagnose what you're seeing today? What made you write a book called We Need to Talk About Anti-Semitism? What is the context in which your book was written? And then what is the context in which you're now going around the country talking to Jewish audiences?
Sure. So I'm a congregational rabbi. It's the best thing you could ever be. And one of the amazing opportunities of being a congregational rabbi is that you get to speak about topics that are morally urgent from the Bima. And for me, anti-Semitism has long been such a topic. Now, interestingly, when I started to talk about anti-Semitism, actually some people said, don't. And I hear some of this in your book, which is, one, people told me anti-Semitism is over, which is hard to believe in this moment, but I actually have a great deal of compassion for that belief. Because in fact, when I was raised, it seemed historical. You went to a movie and you watched it. You went to a museum and you looked at it. You went to a Holocaust testimonial. You heard about it. But it was about them. Those older Jews. It happened before. For the most part, it didn't happen to us. And people would say to me, just look at how well the Jews have done in America. We have access to everything. Every university, we vote the same, we can own property the same, every club, every law firm, we're doing amazing. Why are you talking about this? So I listened to the feedback, I thought about it, and I took it quite seriously, but also I kept talking about anti-Semitism. And the more you talk about something, the more people talk to you about it. So I started hearing all of these questions from congregants, colleagues, friends, and they were questions like, well, I really want to go to the Women's March. That's such an important issue for me right now in this country. I've knitted, 75 pink hats and I have my bus ticket, but now I hear that the leaders of the Women's March are saying these horrible things about Jews. What should I do? There were lots of questions about the workplace. Well, I was asked to sort myself based on my race, but I don't really feel comfortable in that group, but maybe I should, and what's wrong with me, that sort of thing. Then the questions I got the most were questions about college campuses. And they started with things like parents asking me, do they have BDS? at a certain college campus, the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement. And that would be like a shorthand way for parents to know, okay, is this a Jew-friendly campus? Those questions morphed into, should I delete that my child did a tech internship in Israel on their application? Like maybe it's good not to mention Israel? Those questions morphed into, should I foreground my Jewish identity on my college application? Or should I maybe not mention that I'm Jewish at all? Will being Jewish hurt my chances of getting into college? So I'm listening. This is for a decade. And I'm trying my hard to be my best to be a good rabbi. You know, I'm validating and I'm offering education and support. But in the meantime, I see nothing. Nothing in the national discourse about the rise of anti-Semitism in liberal spaces. And it's breaking my heart because this is happening to my people in real time, and I felt like there's nothing out there supporting them and me knowing that something is really wrong. So in 2020, I became the rabbi of what I'll casually call the greatest congregation in Manhattan, the Village Temple. And during the Black Lives Matter protests, our synagogue was attacked with a baseball bat. I mentioned it was during the protests because, you know, there was a great deal of destruction downtown, and it's hard to know what that person had in their heart. But for me, looking at the door of my house of worship, cracked, attacked with a baseball bat, was the moment where I said, okay, enough. I'm going to take my message from my congregation only and tell everyone what I'm seeing and what I'm hearing, because there is something really wrong with what's happening in these spaces. And I was pretty confident I wasn't the only one seeing it, hearing about it. So that's how I decided to write this book.
Do we have any congregants of Diana's here today? Oh, yes. All right. I love that. There were so many interesting parallels, as you say, between this historical account of something that happened quite a long time ago and then the situation we find ourselves in today. I want to just read a book, a quote. I was going to say, which book is this from, but it mentions France, so you know which one it's from. But I want to read it, and I just want to ask you to both respond to it, because I just sort of was like, oh, this feels very real. France has always posed a conundrum for scholars of anti-Semitism. You know which page this is from, right? The European country that showed the most openness to Jews was also the country where modern anti-Semitism first took shape. However, what seems like a paradox is not one. Anti-Semitism developed in direct reaction to that openness. It was the new visibility of Jews in high-profile arenas in France, the Republican state apparatus, the arts, and especially banking in the late 19th century that made them targets for both xenophobic nationalists on the right and for a certain strain of socialists on the left. And that, to me, gets at what it feels like we're at in this moment, where we're sort of coming at it. It's coming at us from all sides. And I was wondering if you could sort of contextualize what you're saying there, and then Diana, if you could respond to sort of these great places for Jews suddenly becoming less great, perhaps for that same reason.
Yeah, it's a great question. And
I thought you were going to say it was a great quote. I was gonna say you wrote it.
It's a great question because in many ways, I think that that France was, 100 years, at least 50 years before the United States, and that we see many of the same things that we're seeing now back then. People don't really realize, I think people tend to think that France is this anti-Semitic country. Really, the opposite was the case. France was the first European country to give Jews full civil rights, and they did it abruptly and suddenly during the French Revolution. In 1790 and 91, they declared that Jews were fully equal citizens. To give a point of comparison, in England, Jews couldn't sit in parliament until the 1850s. In most of Germany, they didn't have full civil rights until 1870. Even in the United States, Jews couldn't hold public office in certain states until late in the 19th century. whereas people don't realize this. In France, they were totally equal as of 1791. And when I say equal, it was really equal. They had access to the top universities, to all these different arenas, including the government, including the arts and business, of course. So it's not a coincidence, I think, that the reaction to this, emancipation of the Jews was felt most strongly in France at the end of the 19th century. And that reaction really starts in the 1880s, and it builds into a kind of frenzy during the Dreyfus Affair. The Dreyfus Affair becomes a kind of catalyst that brings all of this resentment against the Jews, and really, I argue in the book, resentment against modernity, resentment against everything that the French Revolution had brought. So political modernity, economic modernity, all of that gets mapped onto the Jews, and that explodes into the public sphere during the Dreyfus Affair in the 1890s.
All of that gets mapped onto the Jews. I could have used those words as the definition of anti-Semitism, right? Because I think what we're seeing now is the core expression of anti-Semitism, which is let's take a core problem, maybe the core problem of a given society, and use the Jews to talk about it. Let's project it onto the Jews. I want to bring our attention to a way of thinking I call if only the Jews would, right? So if only the Jews would convert to Christianity, we would accept them. That was an older way that anti-Semitism expressed itself. I think Napoleon said something along the lines of, if only the Jews would stop being a people, we could fully accept them, right? Give up your idea of yourself as a nation. If only the Jews, and now I hear it now all the time, oh, I'm so uncomfortable that these billionaires are out there tweeting against universities. If only they would not be billionaires, then they wouldn't think of us as rich and controlling. If only you would stop talking about anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism would reduce, would go down. And I think there's a sort of like fantasy in the story you just told, which is, okay, if only modernity hadn't happened, if only Jews hadn't become emancipated from the ghettos, then maybe, that reality would not have happened in France. But the truth is, it's happened in every, anti-Semitism is a virus. It doesn't know boundaries. It doesn't know geographic boundaries, historical boundaries, gender boundaries, race boundaries, class boundaries. That's not what it does. And it's very sad, in a way, to think about the fact that if only the Jews would is a fantasy. This was going to happen in France, no matter what. This was going to happen here, no matter what. Because, in fact, anti-Semitism is not because of us. It's because of outside forces.
Well, yeah, that framing puts it on us, right? Puts the onus on us to change, to become more acceptable by polite society, to stop talking about what it is that we talk about.
Right. I would just say Dreyfus, I think, is a perfect example of that, because you can't think of a person who more fully embodied what the French nation would have wanted a Jew to be when they granted emancipation. Here was someone who was intensely so patriotic, so devoted to France that he dedicated his whole life to the French. He was also this honest family man who loved his wife, who had 2 beautiful children, who was, honest in everything he did, and still it happened to him. I mean, that's what I think is really proof of your point.
Exactly, yeah.
I want to get into the question of assimilation, right? If only Jews would become more like everyone else. And that comes up with Dreyfus. And then, of course, we're seeing that a lot today, right? Like the way in which assimilation is both used against us and also suggested to us, right? So will you talk a little bit, Maurice, about how Jewish was he?
Yeah, and in fact, in the book, I talk about how I don't really like the term assimilation when it gets applied to Dreyfus, and certain historians, including like Hannah Arendt, basically dismiss Dreyfus as an assimilated Jew. And dismiss most French Jews of his class as assimilated. And I try to show in the book that, in fact, that's not really accurate. I prefer the term integrated rather than assimilated, because to me, assimilated implies the complete surrender of their Jewish identity in order to become this other thing, in this case, France. And I show in the book that that was not at all the case for Dreyfus or his family. They were fully French, but they were also fully Jewish. Now, in Dreyfus's case, he wasn't a religious person. So he was a scientist, he was a rationalist. His wife, though, was religious, and his children too. He married another Jewish person in the Grand Synagogue of Paris. The chief rabbi of France performed his wedding ceremony. Everyone in his family married other Jews, including both of his children. He mostly lived in a Jewish world in France, except, in the army. But even there, too, as I said, there were many, many other Jewish officers. So to me, that connotes integration rather than assimilation.
I just want to say, part of why I think your book is so important is because of what you're describing. It's like restorative Judaism to me. It's fascinating to think that his story's been told, right? So many times in so many places. And yet his Judaism is often and frequently under-discussed and overlooked. Yeah. And there's something about that.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. I think that also goes back to the time of the affair itself, when many of his supporters felt uncomfortable dwelling on his Judaism, and he himself and his wife didn't, in their letters, which were later published, almost never mention anything Jewish, and they clearly were self-censoring. We have evidence that in private, he and his siblings were very aware that he was being accused because of anti-Semitism. And one thing that I found very moving in doing this research, the family, the descendants of Dreyfus, gave their archive fairly recently to the Jewish Museum of Paris, and it contains many, many Jewish ritual objects that had been passed down in that family, including his wife Lucie's ivory-covered Jewish prayer book, which I got to examine. And so to me, that is a sign of a family that felt very, very deeply Jewish, even if they were also very conscious of having to present a model front, which is, I think, something that many Jews, even today, I sense that in your book too, feel it's about this, like, if only Jews would, and I think Jews internalize that and feel the need to, you talk, one of the things I loved about your book is it's very funny also about this very serious topic, and you find incredible anecdotes that I think go right to the heart of the problem. And one of them, as you describe that kind of internalization of these anti-Semitic stereotypes in your book too. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think, first of all, thank you. I think it's like sticking with this point about sort of de-Judaizing, like one of the most significant acts of anti-Semitism of all time. Yes, I still see it now. I see it externally put on us. What's happening right now is not about being Jewish, it's about a political reality, that sort of thing. But I also sometimes see it coming from us because, as you say, we live here and we're learning as well. I see it, for example, a lot with the Holocaust. we have really amazing parents pushing for Holocaust to be taught in their schools. And multiple times I've heard parents say, and I don't fault them for this in any way, I've heard parents say, you know, the Holocaust, to their administrators, like, the Holocaust wasn't only about Jews, you know. It was also, the Nazis also murdered hundreds of thousands of Roma and gay people and disabled people, which is true and should be covered. But it's an instinctive attempt to de-Judaize the Holocaust so that we can get our subject taught, which is kind of what you're talking about with Dreyfus. Like, let's make this a universal story so that other people can relate.
Yeah, you even mentioned in your book the example of that film, The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, that's often taught in grammar schools, which is the most egregious example of that, where it makes a non-Jew the subject of the Holocaust. Why a non-Jewish child when hundreds of thousands of Jewish children were killed? I mean, it's a clear example.
Yeah, I mean, this whole thing is what I call, mostly in my head, antisemitism denial disorder, you know? And if you listen to most conversations or most articles you read about antisemitism, you'll see that there's a part in them where it's always a consideration, maybe this isn't really antisemitism. And it's just fascinating to me to think how difficult it is for the world, for us, to really wrap our heads around what's happening.
It's sort of like in those like early news reports when, you know, a visibly Jewish, a religious person is attacked, and it's like police are not sure yet if that was, you know, if anti-Jewish sentiment was a cause of, and you're like, I see it, you must see it, but it does seem like, you know, we all go out of our way in our own lives, and I think in the broader society to be like, I don't know that was necessarily that. Like, was it really that bad? Was it as bad as I remember? You know, like. And I think that we do try to take on some of this, like, did I do something to maybe bring that on?
Yeah, I even notice it. It's fascinating in so many of the history books, but also movies and popular novels about the Dreyfus Affair. Dreyfus himself is almost never the hero of the story. A blatant example of that was Roman Polanski's recent movie, which didn't get released in the US. You didn't really miss that much, but it's not a great movie. And in fact, he does exactly what I don't like, which is that he makes Picard, the anti-Semitic officer, the hero of the case. And he was a hero. I'm not taking it away. Or probably many of you are familiar with the Hollywood movie The Life of Émile Zola, which is really about the Dreyfus Affair, but they tell it as, you know, with Zola as the hero. People feel very uncomfortable talking about Dreyfus. And I think if you did a survey of how many streets in France are named after Zola compared to how many streets are named after Dreyfus, I think it would be, you know, very, very few for Dreyfus.
So I want to bring us to a word that we hear a lot with this case, traitor, right? And it does feel like a word that follows us a lot, right? Like this idea of dual loyalty, of are Jews trustworthy? Can Jews ever truly be, as Dreyfus wanted to be, a full-fledged member of society? And I want to ask both of you about that question and about that trope that is, you know, very, very, very damaging, I think. And then also about this question of do Jews fit in the modern nation state? I mean, what do we take from this? If Dreyfus' story sounds so depressingly relatable and so depressingly resonant in this moment, like, how have we come much farther? Is that too dark? Am I too depressing?
No. I think, it's a really interesting question. So Dreyfus was, as I said, he was from the eastern province of Alsace, which had gone back and forth between France and Germany over its history. It had become French in 1648. But then it became German again in 1870 after the Franco-Prussian War when Dreyfus was a little boy. And in fact, that was such a nightmarish scenario for him and his family that's what motivated him to join the French army. So Dreyfus's family, like many Jews who felt very loyal and grateful to France, opted for French citizenship. But the kind of stigma of being from this almost German province followed him, and that was the source of a lot of the suspicions against him, even though I would point out that non-Jewish Alsatians didn't have as much suspicion. So Picard himself was also from Alsace, and no one suspected him of being a traitor. So I think there was this sense at the end of the 19th century, especially on the right, there were really two different conceptions of the nation in the 19th century. One was liberal and universalist, that anyone could become a citizen of the modern nation. There actually weren't that many examples of that. The United States was a big one, but so was France, starting during the French Revolution. There was also a more deterministic, racist view of the nation that was really the kind of dominant mode of nationalism. And many people in France in the 19th century wanted to push France towards that model. And for them, Jews were fundamentally foreign.
So this is a really fascinating topic and question. I think if you had asked this question to me or to many of the people in my community, before October 7th, there would be no question at all. We're Americans. I am a third generation. My grandparents were born in this country. Everything about us is American. And I never felt separate. But now I think the Jewish question is back. But I don't think it's necessarily being asked externally. I think it's being asked internally by Jews. So from going around the country and meeting with different communities, I've heard Jews post-October 7th going through what I call a great reassessment. And Jews are thinking, maybe these institutions that I helped build and I thought were mine and have shared my values don't. Maybe these media outlets that I've relied on to shape my views and to give me information don't seem like they're reflecting what I believe. Maybe I'm not as American as I thought. And I think the reaction and the outpouring of anti-Semitism post-October 7th in the US has pushed Jews across the country to feel less American and more Jewish. And I'm really fascinated for the potential wonderful and terrible outcomes that could lead to.
Let's talk about that more Jewish piece, because it seems like, the comedian Alex Edelman says in his show Just for Us, he says the answer to anti-Semitism isn't anti-Semitism. It's like pro-Judaism, right? And so I guess for you as a rabbi, how do we combat this, right? Where do we go, and what do we draw from to both find strength, but also find our identities and find our place in this moment?
Sure. So in the book, I give lots of tactical, practical strategies. Right now, I'm going to give you what I really believe and feel, which could be very frustrating for you, so I'm sorry in advance.
And you have to buy the book to get the practical advice. That's the trick here.
One great thing to do when there are people active in the world that would like nothing more than to exterminate Judaism is to do Jewish things. God gave us a book. The book tells us how to live, how to be in relationship, how to mourn, how to struggle, how to ask serious questions. God gave us a list in that book of behaviors, of things to do, commandments meets vote, okay? All of those teachings, that sacred text, are the pathway to sustaining the Jewish people, okay? Never underestimate the power of who we are. We're the eternal people, right? I mean, you could do this better than I could. Like, we've outlived the Babylonians and the Romans and the Crusades and the Shoah. Like, we will outlast Harvard, you know? We will outlast TikTok. Like, we will be here. And this is not an accident or a coincidence. It's the realization of a religious truth to me, the rabbi.
That is beautiful. Wow, yeah. So we're going to also open this up to questions, I believe, from the audience. JVC staffers will be coming around to to take pencils, collect your little cards. I do want to play on this like internal, external conversation, because I do think that is something we heard before, right? Like, the Jews then were sort of like, no, let's not focus on the Judaism part of the story. And I think that is something we do tend to do, right? Like, don't make it about the fact that it's Jewish. Just like, let's universalize it. And so I wondered if you would speak a little bit more about how that happened and the implications of that within French society.
Yeah, so it's interesting because we see this right away during the affair, and there were debates about whether Jews should publicly defend Dreyfus or not. And in fact, several of the kind of key early Dreyfusards, including the chief rabbi of France, whose name was Zadok Khan, decides to work behind the scenes, and he has help from leaders of the Jewish community, but they're scared at the time of how it would seem if these powerful Jews were seen defending another Jew. And in fact, the anti-Semites were completely paranoid about that. There was a myth of a Jewish syndicate that they thought was in league, pulling the levers of power to get Dreyfus released. So they felt like they had to work in private, and it was only much later that everything they had done on behalf of Dreyfus was revealed. An interesting little sidebar here is that at the time, this then fueled the early Zionists. So Herzl and Max Nordau, who were inventing Zionism in the very years that the Dreyfus Affair was playing out. And one of the things they would say in their speeches, like at the Zionist Congress, was, look at the French Jews. They've done nothing on behalf of Dreyfus. So in fact, and you can imagine how the French Jews, who were in fact doing quite a lot on behalf of Dreyfus, must have felt, kind of caught in the trap.
Part of why I love the setup of this conversation, of having us together, is because I think one thing that troubles me about the way we're talking about anti-Semitism now is that it's strangely divorced from history. And I don't understand how anyone could really get what's going on now without knowing about the blood libel and pogroms. How can you understand the power of the myth of anti-Semitism if you don't know about the Dreyfus Affair? And I think...
I couldn't agree more.
Luckily, there's a book about it. Right over there.
I think that's something that we can do more of, is educate ourselves and speak more about what's happening right now is not anomalous. And in fact, it's deeply familiar and almost predictable. My book came out before October 7th, okay?
Right, that's one of the amazing things, if I can just say that you saw it all before. I mean, so nothing could have surprised you after October 7th, I don't think, because it's all in your book. Every chapter is basically what's happening now.
It's for two reasons. One, I listened to people and they were telling me everything. But two, it's because if you understand the history of the Jewish people and how and when anti-Semitism has impacted us, then you would know that all of these sort of clues that I was seeing in the world would add up to this terrible outpouring of anti-Semitism that we're living in now, which I wish we weren't.
You guys keep talking. I'm going to read questions.
It's interesting, this question of the importance of history. So I run a program to study anti-Semitism at Yale. I started the program in 2011, so we were also, kind of ahead of the curve there. And when I started the program, that seemed evident to me that we had to be looking at both historical and contemporary forms of anti-Semitism. But I actually took a fair amount of criticism, actually, at the time. People saying, really, someone said to me, and in fact published this, what do we need to study the Nazis for? That form of anti-Semitism has been solved. They said it's like a doctor, and this is actually a prominent professor wrote this, it's like a doctor trying to cure tuberculosis. It's a disease that we already have cured. In fact, we have not totally cured tuberculosis, but on top of that, so that that somehow studying history is a distraction from the current moment, and to me, that's just inconceivable to me that we, could look at what's going on now and not try to put it in historical perspective is just.
I've become more cynical the longer this has gone on, and I've decided that divorcing Jews from our own history is actually an intentional tactic to further anti-Semitism. Because one thing I look at just emotionally is like the traumatic invalidation of October 7th. What happened to us emotionally in the United States and Jews around the globe was so horrible, second only to what happened to Jews physically on October 7th. And to watch that be ignored, diminished, condescended to, is to ignore the very real generational trauma that attack brought up. So I'm starting to think it's like a willful ignorance situation where people are saying, where people are not talking about Jewish history. I mean, I can imagine 100 think pieces about the relationship between then and now, and I've probably seen, 2.
Right. Also, I think we see that with the Holocaust now. There's this kind of, I hear on the left, Jews are only talking about the Holocaust in order to get sympathy and distract from what they're doing to the Palestinians. And, to me, there's nothing more important, especially now, than to teach about that history. So next semester in the fall, I'm teaching a class again on representing the Holocaust in literature and film. And I was happy to see that a lot of people have signed up for the class. So I think there's a hunger now, and not only Jewish students, actually. There's a hunger to understand that history, and I think we absolutely have to study it. Okay.
These are some great questions. I want to start with the most practical first. Who was the traitor? And please tell us more about it.
Yes, I'm happy to talk about the traitor.
Don't spoil it, though.
Yeah. So Dreyfus, as I said, was like this model family man from a wealthy family, so he had no motivation to commit the crime, to offer to sell secrets to Germany. He, in every way, was the least likely person to commit treason. The guy who did it is this guy named Ferdinand Walsen Esterhazy from a minor branch of the Hungarian nobility, but from a family that had lived in France for many generations. He had traitor written across his forehead. He even looked like a traitor. He had these beady eyes and this like walrus mustache. And he was a gambler, a womanizer, completely dissolute. He even swindled members of his own family. He told them if they would give him money, he would use his connections with Jewish bankers, including the Rothschilds, to invest their money, and he just kept it and spent it. So he would go blatantly during the day to the German embassy to offer to sell secrets. So, and it was just inconceivable. What's kind of sad, though, is that he basically got away with it. So when the proof of his crime came to light, he was put on trial. He had a court-martial. He was found innocent. He then fled to England, and he basically lived out the rest of his life there. He would occasionally sell his story for money, and it's kind of a sad coda.
Diana, what do you think of the term Jew hatred?
Okay, so I'm imagining where your question is coming from. I've been asked it before. So I think that some people don't like the term anti-Semitism because it's not really that specific, and it was invented by or put forward by an anti-Semite. So maybe if we called it something else, it would improve the fighting of this thing. So I think Jew hatred is an attempt to do that. I am a pragmatist. I call the thing what most people call the thing, which is anti-Semitism. So I'll use any term if it works, but I don't think changing the terminology will really make a dent.
And I'll just say that there are enormous academic debates about this, including countless articles on whether there should be a hyphen.
The hyphen.
In
Everything is about the hyphen.
Semitism,
Yes.
right? So because
By the way, for the record, Tablet has removed the hyphen.
okay,
So your
Did I?
lower
good.
yeah.
I'm anti-hyphen.
anti-hyphen.
I'm anti-hyphen.
I used to be an anti-Semite, but now I'm anti-hyphen.
Right.
I think that's how it works,
yes.
right?
Because, and I'll just tell you, so the hyphen, and some people then it's like, should you
S
capitalize the
capitalize,
S? And often my word processing program wants me to do that and will auto
Well, it's
correct.
anti-Semitic.
Yeah, exactly. But I think the reasoning there, or at least my reasoning, is that Semitism is this problematic term that has like kind of racist connotations, and so by hyphenating and capitalizing, we're giving too much credence to this outdated kind of racist notion. So instead, this is the more kind of modern term that we're kind of reappropriating now.
Okay, so I did not see this coming, but this is amazing. Hi, my name is Elsa. I'm Alfred Dreyfus's great-great-granddaughter.
No way.
I'm very pleased to be here today.
Oh my God!
Right?
Wow.
That's amazing.
Okay.
Welcome.
Yeah.
We hear a lot that French Jews are doomed and should move either to the U.S. or to Israel. What are your thoughts on this matter? And you're talking to a Dreyfus, so just be careful. Like,
yes.
This is real.
Wow. This is really fascinating. Let me just say, I'm incredibly honored to have someone from the family, and I conclude the book with what happened to the Dreyfus family after the Dreyfus affair. This is one of the most kind of unbelievable things. So Dreyfus himself dies in the mid-1930s, so he doesn't witness the Holocaust, but the rest of the family does. And his wife has to go, Lucy goes into hiding. She's hidden in a convent, does survive the war. He has 2 children and their families. One, his daughter and her family stay in France. His son actually comes to New York during the war. His favorite granddaughter, Madeleine, was a resistance fighter, was arrested, but then deported as a Jew and died in Auschwitz. I've been to the Dreyfus family tomb in Montparnasse Cemetery. It's very moving. I have a picture of it in the book, and you see Dreyfus at the top with Madeleine right under him. So yeah, should French Jews France used to be the country that sent the fewest Jews to Israel, and now it's the country that sends the most Jews to Israel. It's partly because it's one of the countries with the most Jews. People don't realize that it actually has the biggest Jewish population outside of Israel and the United States. So I think that France, and this is one of the reasons that I started this program to study anti-Semitism in 2011, because France was really ground zero for anti-Semitism. They were feeling it much earlier than other places, partly because they have the biggest population in Europe, both of Jews and of Muslims, many of whom live near each other, and there's a lot of Islamist violence against Jews, including, horrible cases that I'm sure you guys know, the attack on the kosher supermarket, the attack on the Jewish school in Toulouse. I could go on and on. So I think that some French Jews are rightly questioning what's going on there. But I do have to say the big difference between the Dreyfus Affair or certainly between World War II and now is that the French state is not anti-Semitic now. And the French state has been pretty clear. I think the French political leaders have been pretty clear about the need to fight anti-Semitism and this ideology of Republican universalism in France, which mandates that everyone be treated equally, is something that the French take very, very seriously. And so one of the things, I'll just say this one other thing. We had a visiting speaker from France this week, and she's been horrified at what's happening here because in France, they don't have the First Amendment. So in France, you're not allowed to deny the Holocaust. You're not allowed to make anti-Semitic statements. You can be prosecuted for these things, and they do. So in a sense, France, it's not as bad, actually, right now in France as here, I would say.
And I'll add to that. One of the things I've been trying to do in this post-October 7th world is learn from Jews who are not like me. And I've learned a lot from two groups specifically. One has been from Persian Jews who have a lot of insight and lived experience, growing up in Iran and during the revolution and fleeing. But the other group has been French Jews. And one thing I've heard repeatedly from them is that what they see going on here is similar to what they endured during the Second Intifada in France. So I think they view themselves in some ways as ahead of us in a bad way in terms of anti-Semitism, like they've lived through this sort of thing before. But that's something I encourage everyone else to do also. Like, it's good to talk to Jews similar to you, but it's also really good and useful to learn from Jews that are different from you, even if you disagree with them, and maybe especially.
Diana? Yes. I am experiencing anti-Semitism at work and have reported many incidents to HR and executives who are only tolerating and enabling it to continue. What can I do?
I'm really sorry. You're not the only one. This is happening in workplaces throughout the country. The first thing I usually tell people is something it sounds like you're already doing, which is learn how to use the system. That's true for all of us, whether it's the DOE, the Department of Ed, whether it's your HR department, whether it's a city organization, et cetera. I think we've quickly done this, but there's a lot more to go. Learn how to use whatever system you're in, learn the policies of your institution. You may not be able to win. And that's very disheartening. But basically, when it comes to fighting anti-Semitism broadly, there are three strategies, right? There's stay and fight. That's what you're doing right now. You're reporting, you're knowing about reality and what's anti-Semitic. You're working to change that system from within. Many Jews throughout this country are doing the exact same thing on their college campuses or in their workplace. They're staying and fighting. Option 2 is what I want to tell you about, which is leave and rebuild, right? Jews have done this throughout our very long history. We were exiled. We rebuilt. That's why you and I are sitting here right now. We were kicked out of Spain. We went to Tzfat. We weren't necessarily happy about that. But we wrote things and created things. And because of what happened in that rebuilding process, we're saying the words that they wrote every week in our Shabbat service, for example. You may have to leave, and you may have to start something new, whether it's a new institution or working at a new place. I hope it doesn't come to that, but if it does, know that you have that Jewish entrepreneurial history behind you, and let that spur you on. So the first option was stay and fight. The second option is leave and rebuild. The third option is do nothing, and I forbid you to do option 3.
I mean, there's no better way to end. Diana Fer, Maurice Samuels, the books are right there. The authors will be right here. They will be signing books. They will be solving anti-Semitism. Thank you both. Thank you to the Jewish Museum
you.
and the Jewish Book Council.
Thank you.
And thanks, Steph.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you. So were you. That was really